All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Léon van Ommen. That was pronounced pretty well, David. Thank you for that. I'm a lecturer in divinity and practical theology at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm also co-director of the Center for the Study of Autism and Christian Community. I have the pleasure of supervising one of the participants here, Hannah, who also was the driving force behind this course. So well done, Hannah. And it's my pleasure to talk you through some of the aspects of interviewing today. So, what is my experience with autism research so far? That is primarily through a project I'm doing on autism and worship. So I'm a theologian. I study churches, and my question is, how do autistic people experience worship? How do they understand God? And what can the whole church learn from that? So with that in mind, let us start the session. It will be the usual format. I will present some things, and then after 10 minutes or something like that, we will have a 5-minute break for you to reflect on the questions and so on. We do that about 4 or 5 times. So with that, let me show you the outline for this session. I don't have a PowerPoint, instead I have a mind map. Don't worry, I will zoom in. Oh, wait a sec, I need to share my screen. Just a second. Right, can you see my mind map?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I will zoom in a moment, but this is the overview of the mind map. So I'm hoping to talk you through this mind map today, and mind map on interviewing. And I've suggested all kinds of questions for your reflective journal to reflect on how does that apply to interviewing autistic people. So with that, let me zoom in on the first part. So the first thing, 3 things that we are going to talk about before taking a 5-minute break for the reflective questions is the why of interviewing, the place of the interview in overall research design, and then the status of the data. So those are kind of preliminary questions. It's not the interviewing itself, but I think it's really important to have some of this in mind, and it never hurts to think twice about those things. So first of all, why would you interview? I find a table by Jennifer Mason in one of her books very helpful on qualitative researching. And she has this table in which she asks, which data source helps me best answer my research questions? So let me try to open this. Here you see, so this is a handout, but the table is really here. So you see research questions, data sources and methods, justification, practicalities, ethical issues. In other words, so let me give an example of my own research or an earlier version of my research project. So for example, if we take the central research question, how do autistic worshippers experience the Sunday Mass or the Sunday worship or Sunday church, whatever term is best for you, then you can divide it into several research questions. How many autistic people join churches, for example? Now, if we want to know the answer to that question, what is the best source that we can use and the best methods to answering that question? Now, when we talk about how many people do this or that, that's kind of a quantitative question rather than qualitative. So perhaps for this question, we would need statistical evidence, if that is available. Maybe we need that from other organizations to compare. And if we don't have the information, maybe we can do a survey. So in a strict sense, that would be a very closed way of interviewing. Although in qualitative interviewing, we wouldn't count this as an interview. Another question then, what is the experience of autistic people of Sunday Mass? The second question here. So here for data source and methods, we can think about interviews with or written accounts of people with autism or Asperger's in an earlier version of this project, when it was still called Asperger's. that was the focus then in this example. We can do interviews with those who care for people with Asperger's. We can do focus groups. We can do an online forum maybe. So different ways. And it's helpful to break down your research question into sub-questions, as your supervisor will all tell you, and think about for each question, what's the best way to answering this question. All right, so that is on the why. Which data source helps me best answer my research question? And then if that's an interview, then you need to also to be able to give the answer, why is that the best way of gathering my information or collecting my data? Okay, so then secondly, we need to think about the place of an interview in the overall research design. So when are you going to do your interviews? Is that at the beginning of a project to collect as much broad data as possible, or is that later in your project when you have quite a clear idea of where you're heading, but there is some bits and pieces that you lack the information for, and therefore you need to do interviews? So that's possible. So think carefully about the interview in the overall research design. And then very important, and this might be a bit technical, but nevertheless very important, it needs to be congruent with your theoretical framework and your analytical strategy. So you have a particular framework from which you're working, whether you like it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, but you're never neutral, right? No one ever is neutral. So you have particular presuppositions, a particular theoretical or philosophical framework, an epistemological framework. What do you think counts as knowledge, in other words? And it needs to be congruent with that. So for example, if you use a narrative framework, you're probably thinking along the lines of co-constructing knowledge. If you do that, then you will ask certain questions that elicit stories, so you can analyze stories because you would do a narrative analysis. So all of that you need to think through from the beginning of your project. Don't just do interviews. Think about carefully where it fits in your design. And then the states of the data is another important thing to think about. So what do you think interviews are? What do you think your conversation with a participant is? Is that a direct access to experience? Or is it a narrative that you co-construct as interviewer and interviewee? Is that a story that you're telling together? In most cases, it will be, in the sense that a participant always gives particular answers to you because you're asking particular questions, or because you are a particular person. Maybe you identify as autistic yourself, and therefore you bond better with an autistic participant. So all kinds of questions there. But think about the states of your data. What is the data that you get? And how does that fit again in your overall research design, including your philosophical presuppositions? Okay, good. With that, we are going to pause for a minute, and I will give you a couple of minutes, say 5 minutes, to think about the following questions. And Hannah, maybe you can put them in the chat box as you usually do. So the first question, which is in your reflective journal that was uploaded for today, I think. If you're planning on doing interviews, why do you think they're the best data source to answer your research question? And maybe you can use that table that I showed you with the research question, the data source and methods, and the justification. The second question, what do you expect from your interviews? And that falls into two parts. To A, what part of your research question do you want your interviews to answer? And to B, to what extent do they give you direct access to the experience of your participants, or to what extent is the interview co-constructed? And then thirdly, does interviewing autistic people change any of your answers to the above questions compared to interviewing non-autistic people? So the first two questions are really about what I just explained. And then thirdly, I want you to think about, if I interview autistic people, does that change any of the above? All right, shall we move on? All right, I hope it was a good experience for you to answer those questions for yourself, or at least think about them. we are going to move on. So we are going from why and the place of the interview and the status of the data to the next part, and I'll share my screen before moving on. There you go. So we are moving to reliability, and then more interestingly, maybe what type of interview and the topic list. Before, again, we will take a break. So first, just one more thing, kind of preliminary things to consider, and that concerns the reliability. So how are you going to make sure that this is a reliable interview? If you're just going to talk to someone, maybe even do a very nice interview guide and all the rest of it, but you don't record it, why would anyone believe you that that is exactly what that person said? Because your memory will, well, for some people it will be perfect, but for most people it won't. So you will need to record your interview, whether that's an audio recording or a video recording. That depends on the particular person that you're interviewing, the particular analysis that you want to do. To what extent do you want to analyze nonverbal language? Maybe if you're interviewing non-speaking autistic people, then that becomes even much more important. But also, if you're interviewing verbal people, then still it might be something that you want to analyze. For example, in discourse analysis, it's not uncommon to use video recording to see what the body language is when people say something. So those are things to consider, but by all means do record your interview, store it on a safe place. And then explicate your own views beforehand. In other words, in your research journal, write down the answer to your own research questions. What do you think about the topic? Because in that way, you will later on, you will have a chance to compare your own thoughts and those of your interviewees and see how they differ, where your own understanding is enriched, all of that. But it adds to the transparency of the whole process to explicate your own views beforehand. It will also help you to know better what to ask for. And then there is just a couple of questions for you to consider in terms of reliability of your interviews. Would you use multiple interviews? So interviewing people more than once, does that add to the reliability, or does it actually distract from it? Would you repeat certain interviews? Would you use multiple methods? Maybe a narrative interview, but also a phenomenological interview or something else, and multiple analysis methods. So all kinds of questions to consider there when it comes to reliability, but also, again, back to the very beginning, why do you do the interview? What is it that you want to get out of the interview, as it were? What will help you best to answer your research questions? Now, moving on, we need to consider what type of interview are you going to do. I've hinted at that a couple of times now. So the most basic thing to consider is how open are your questions going to be. So you have the scale from very open on the one hand to very closed on the other hand. So as I said in the first part, a very, very closed way of interviewing would be called a survey, right? Or in other words, a survey would be a very closed way of asking questions. On the other hand, you can think of phenomenology, for example, where you hopefully lead with only 2-3 questions, maybe, just to hear the story of the participants and let the participant kind of steer the direction of the interview. Most people in most research projects end up with some kind of in-between, and that is what we call a semi-structured interview. And that is by far the most common way of interviewing, at least to my knowledge. So a semi-structured interview means that you do have certain questions that you want to ask, but that you're quite flexible in the order that you're asking, and you're quite flexible in the way the interview goes. So you're quite happy to let your interview, the conversation, be steered by the participant, whilst at the same time you keep in mind the kind of questions that you do want to ask, that you do want to have an answer to. And then a couple of considerations. How long should an interview last? It's very common to have interviews of 30 to 45 minutes, but some interviews take much longer. But then you need to consider, well, maybe at one point there's fatigue both in the interviewee, but also in you. Maybe you just can't concentrate so long. Maybe it's good to pause at one point and say, well, maybe we need to, continue at another time. So think about those questions. How long should an interview last? Now, in my experience, when I interview people, I can't tell beforehand. So in my information letter, I will say probably around 45 minutes, but I will add, it depends on how much you want to share with me. Or in other words, how talkative people are. And some are much more talkative than others. So that's something to consider. And then the question, who do you interview? So going back to that, to the first considerations, why are you interviewing? The question, who do you interview, ties in with that. What is the kind of information that you want to have? Is it just random people that you sample randomly, or would you do a theoretical sample so you have particular kind of people that you want to interview? Do you want to have expert interviews, say with CEOs of companies that you want to do your research with, and who have that kind of expert knowledge about a particular way things work in the company? All kinds of questions to consider there. Who do you interview? And again, what do you expect your interview to do for you in terms of your research project? And then a question, who is present at the interview? And especially when we talk about interviewing autistic people, and also more broadly, when we interview, or not more broadly, but differently, if we interview people with learning disabilities or learning differences, it might be very helpful if someone else said that interview, or if you interview someone with anxiety, for example. Now, in literature, in the standard kind of interviewing literature, what I have read, at least, is that you're discouraged from having other people at the interview because other people might influence what the interviewee feels free to share with you. And so there is that factor of influence. Now, that's certainly there. I won't deny it. In my experience so far, especially when I interviewed people with learning difficulties, and when there was an overlap between autism and learning difficulties, or when both were present, it has been hugely, immensely helpful that there was another person, a caregiver normally, who would be a trusted person for the interviewee. And that has been tremendously helpful, sometimes also in terms of translation. So I also did a project in Kenya. Now, my Swahili is not very good, i.e. non-existent. Let alone the other local languages that were spoken in the area. And so there was, per definition, a translator, because otherwise I wouldn't be interviewing there. And that was okay. But very often that translator was also someone, again, who was trusted by the people that I interviewed. And that was very helpful. Just another example, when I did interviews in Singapore, it was very helpful that the gatekeeper was present there. At first, I was skeptical, again, having in the back of my mind all the books that I read about interviewing, and you shouldn't have that influencing factor of the gatekeeper. In this case, it was the pastor of a church. But actually, it turned out to be very, very helpful, because he could also culturally translate some things that I was asking, and I could see that it put people at ease rather than the contrary. So, and of course, you can never tell, did people really share everything that they would, also without the pastor present or that gatekeeper? You can never tell, but I had at least a strong feeling that it was helpful rather than hindering the interview process. So this is something to consider. Who is present at the interview? Do you allow people to be present? Who is that? And but always the question, how does that influence the answers that you're getting? How does that influence and impact the conversation, and therefore the data that you're collecting? So it is something to consider. And then when we've considered all those things, we are going to make a topic list. So what are you going to ask? Now, the first thing to keep in mind here, and this is really, 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 really important, your research question is not your interview question. Your research question is seldom fit to be asked directly in an interview. So you need to break down, first of all, which part of your research question do you need your interviewees to answer? And then you need to break that down into questions that are understandable, that are accessible, and that together cover in a very broad and wide sense that part of your research question or research project that you want this information for, or I call it information, but again, what is the status of the data? You can also say the co-constructed story. So I hope that's clear that your research question is not your interview question. And then you need to do a brainstorm of topics and of subtopics. So you will probably have a couple of main topics in your interview, and then under each main topic, you might have subtopics, sub-questions that you want to answer. And then you need to think about the order of topics. And there are some do's and don'ts, but then it's very flexible as well, of course. So there should be a logical order. That should be a no-brainer. And then it might be helpful to go from structured questions to unstructured questions. So you might want some very practical information about participants that you might have collected that beforehand in a consent form or a fact sheet or whatever, or you might just ask it at the start of the interview. So those could be some very structured questions, and then you can open up the interview and let your interviewee steer a bit more. You can do it the other way around, but usually this is a good order, an order that works well. And then I would advise to go from easy to difficult. So very often you will interview people that you don't know, whom you've met maybe once or twice, maybe you've emailed back and forth with your participants, but you need to get to know each other a little bit. You need to create that bond. You need to ease in your interviewee. So start with some kind of light-hearted questions. Tell me something about yourself. Right? As a very open question, maybe you want to have a bit more closed question, but not closed. I mean, a question that is a little bit more concrete. But tell me something about your experience in school, if you're interviewing pupils, for example, or your experience at university. What courses do you take? Those kind of easy questions, just to let participants say something about themselves. And then as the interview progresses, you can ask the more difficult questions. If you interview people about things that have happened in the past or up to the present or not up to the present, think about the chronological order of your questions. Might be from past to future, might be future to past, any other order that makes sense. And then you need to consider whether you want to start with very broad questions and go to small specific questions, or do you want to start with smaller questions and open it up to broader questions. All kinds of things to consider when you order your topics, but it's important to have that order and think carefully about the order of your interview questions. Having said that, if you're doing open or semi-structured interviews, you also need to be willing to change around your order. Now, I need to say one thing about this. One thing that you might read in the literature is that if you do semi-structured interviews, then sometimes you will have a question already covered by answers of your participant or in the conversation. In my experience, it's very helpful if a particular topic that you want to ask about is already covered to ask the question nonetheless. 9 out of 10, I do get extra things from that conversation that are very useful in my analysis. So I wouldn't hesitate to just mention that and say, well, we covered this kind of, but I was going to ask you about it. Maybe I'll just ask the question anyway and see whether there's anything else that you want to say in this regard. And again, very often I do get some extra information or experiences or stories. So that's helpful to do. So don't be afraid of that kind of repetition. Very important, ask one question at a time, not 2 questions. One question at a time. And then be open. Do not, and this is something that I do see happen a lot, that people ask suggestive or leading questions. Be as open as possible. So not so for example, looking at a building outside and you want to ask questions about it, or on a picture, do you also think that this is a really ugly building? Well, that's a leading question, right? Maybe it's better to ask, so what do you think about this building? And then your intonation is important as well, of course. What do you think about this building is probably suggested, okay? Maybe a silly example, but the point is clear, I hope. And then, and I see that I had something else here. Be careful with giving examples. So when you give examples, you are already steering the conversation, and there's a very, very high chance that your participant will pick up on that example, maybe even stick with that example. Whereas if you wouldn't have given the example, they might have come up with their own examples, which is more useful for you as a researcher. And then the question is, how flexible is your topic list? What is the impact of a flexible topic list on your data analysis? So if you have kind of a structured order of your interviews and they're all the same, well, that makes your analysis easier. But if your methodological premise is that you want the conversation to be steered by the participant, and so you are flexible with the order of your questions and even maybe the particular questions being asked and topics covered, then it makes your analysis maybe more difficult, but you're true to your methodology. So think about those kind of things. Right. With that, we are going to pause again for 5 minutes, and here are some questions for you to think about. What are the pros and cons of having someone else present at the interview? For example, a caregiver, an interpreter, a gatekeeper. And what is a good number of questions for your interview if you are doing interviews? 5 minutes. All right, let's move on. I'm going to share my screen again. So we're going to talk about interview structure and types of questions. I'm going to do this a bit quicker than the first parts. This is not very specific to interviewing autistic people, although the questions in your reflective journal are all meant to help with that, thinking through how does this apply to interviewing autistic people. Right. So the interview structure, very briefly, quite obviously, you will start with an opening. At opening, I already mentioned building rapport is really, really important with your interviewee. So maybe do you start with small talk or not? Question, especially when working with autistic people. Some will hate it, right? Some will love it. Some will need it. Some won't. Then building rapport, introducing yourself. How do you identify? Really important. So maybe you identify as autistic, non-autistic. I'm working in a church. How do I identify as a church member? People will ask me, are you ordained minister or not? That kind of questions. But also, do you identify as a researcher working at the University of? That can be quite daunting, quite intimidating. So think carefully about how you introduce yourself. Always thank people for taking part, of course. That goes without saying. And then introducing your study. Maybe you want to use visual social script, certainly when working with autistic people. Maybe that's something to consider. How do you do that? Do you need help from someone to create that? From someone who knows the people that you interview very, very well. And then also consider whether you want to send the questions beforehand or not. And what does that do? Does that help? Does that hinder? How does that influence your research project, right? And then there's, of course, the ethics and just a couple of things. The information sheet and consent form should be sent beforehand. You need to have permission for the recording, and you will need to make clear what you will do with your data. Just a couple of things. There are more things when it comes to ethics, of course, and you're a university and your supervisor should keep you right there. Now, then you ask your first introductory questions. You ask your main questions. Very important to summarize every now and then. Did I understand you correctly when I summarized as this or that? Very helpful to give to also receive feedback from your participant, whether you have interpreted them correctly or not. And then, of course, there are follow-up questions, there are prompting questions. So follow-up is following up on a particular topic. Prompting is you haven't heard enough yet, you want more examples or that kind of thing, so you prompt them a little bit more. Don't be afraid to do that. It's very useful often to do that. And then in closing, maybe a summary, maybe a couple of highlights that you've heard, and then the golden question. And the golden question is there anything that we haven't covered? You know, this is the topic, this is what I'm researching, these were my questions. Is there anything else that I should have asked you, or is there anything else that you want to add? In one case, in my PhD project, it led to a project, complete project and 2 articles, because I asked that one question. So who knows what comes out of that question? But very often, I mean, no, half of the time probably people will say, "Oh, it's fine. Those were brilliant questions, all fine, nothing to add." And half the time people will say, "Well, yeah, I just want to add this or that." And it's just very often you get something else that you hadn't asked for, and it's very helpful to your project. Not always, but it happens. So that's what I call the golden question at the end of your interview. And then in closing, confirm arrangements. For example, are you going to send the transcript to your respondent or your participant for feedback or not? Think about, again, what does that do? Because if you do, and they say, well, I don't want you to use that, well, tough luck for you. Although that continuing consent is important. Or if they say, well, yeah, I thought about it then, but actually I think about it now in a different way. What does that do for your analysis? What does that do to your project? So I'm not saying those are problems, but those are things to think carefully about, and how that fits with your methodology and all of that. Then types of questions to ask. As said before, open questions versus closed. And then in terms of content, you have the main questions, the prompting, and the follow-up. So prompting can be for clarification, or it was not concrete enough, you want a concrete example, or you want to deepen the topic. And following up, it has to do with consequences of answers that were given. Again, don't be suggestive. It doesn't help your project, it doesn't help anyone. Don't be suggestive. And then maybe you want to be creative. And I think when we interview autistic people in particular, we need to think about creative methods. And then there's always the effect, what helps for autistic people usually helps for other people as well. And so think about using pictures, for example, or using stick figures. In one of my questions in my project on autism and liturgy, I asked them about their experience of the worship service, particular elements, and I asked them to put an emoji on each element. For most people that helped, for some it didn't, and some invented some new emojis, so it's really nice. Think about scales. On a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say? And with that, I don't mean you do a survey, but it helps you to think, it helps your participant to think through particular things and to compare things, or put things in a particular order. For example, what do you think is more important, A, B, C, and you give them a list and they put them in order. So those are more creative methods that very often can be used as part of your interview, and very often will be very helpful. And of course, there are loads of other creative methods. You can even use arts, as Joe Long said in the last session, all of that. So, and then here is another golden rule, and that's the 10 seconds rule. I only have 2 golden rules, but this is the other one, the golden 10 seconds rule. Don't be afraid of silence. People need time to think about what you're asking. Some people think very quickly on the spot and can answer you within a second, but most people will need a little bit longer. Don't be afraid of silence. In our society, we've become less and less used to silence. We don't like silence in conversations, that's awkward, but actually in an interview setting, it doesn't matter. And have at least 10 seconds before you give a prompt or clarify the question or whatever. Yeah, very important. And then just to finish this off before we break again, you might want to do a pilot interview. A an interview itself with piloting your protocol, your interview guide, your strategy. In one of my projects, I had 2 different ways of asking the question, with a timeline and the other with writing a book kind of thing, or outlining a book. And I piloted both to see what worked best, and that was really useful to do. You can also do a focus group to find out what are the kind of questions that I should be asking and pilot some of that. And then there's loads of challenges that you might encounter. And that's the last part of this interview mind map. Just for you to think about, and we can discuss that later. Respondent asks your opinion. What do you do with that? Respondents or participants refuse to respond to a question, or they don't understand the question, or there's just this long silence and you don't know what to do with it because nothing happens. Participant doesn't know what to do with it. What do you do with silence? And then the flat batteries. Always have an extra pair of batteries for your audio recorder. Or there's not enough time for your interview. And loads of other challenges that you might think about beforehand. So, you know, a kind of thing, a strategy, that you have a strategy in place, what to do with that. All right, I'm going to give you, well, what shall we do? 10 minutes for the remainder of your research, questions in your reflective journal. So those questions are, what practicalities do you need to consider before you can start your interview? For example, do you send your questions beforehand? Where will the interview take place? Then can you plan on strategies for building rapport? Have you allowed enough time? Have you allowed enough sessions? Then the next question, if you share your transcript afterwards and an interviewee has changed their opinion on something or otherwise wants you to change the transcript, how do you deal with that? And then finally, think about types of questions you want to ask. How flexible can you be in terms of content or the way that you ask the question? And then you can also think about challenges, of course. So I suggest that we take 10 minutes for that, plus a 5-minute break to get a cup of coffee or feed your cat or anything else that you want to do with that time. So let's be back in 15 minutes, so say 10 past 4.